The town of Oakhaven didn't forgive two things: a man who smelled like dried blood and desperation, and a woman who took up too much space in a church pew. Caleb was the first, Cora was the second, and when his feral twins pointed their filthy fingers at her, the whole damn town choked on its judgment. The mud of Oakhaven sucked at Caleb's boots like a toothless mouth. He hated this town, hated the sour smell of coal smoke, the rotting boardwalks, the cheap lavender water the women splashed on their necks to hide the stench of sweat and tight quarters. Up on the ridge, the winter cold was a clean knife. Down here in the valley, it was damp rot, seeping straight into the marrow of a man's bones. Caleb hitched the bundle of stiff, frost-rimed beaver pelts higher on his shoulder. The leather strap bit into his collarbone. He didn't adjust it. The dull, biting pain kept him awake. Behind him, two small shadows dragged their feet through the freezing muck. Sam and Bess, 6 years old, feral as trapped minks. They wore wool coats, 2 sizes too big, the hems caked in frozen yellow mud. They smelled of pine pitch, stale urine, and the greasy scent of roasted rabbit. Caleb hadn't bathed them in 3 weeks. Hauling water to the cabin required energy he didn't have, and melting snow over the hearth took time he spent setting traps. He wasn't a good father. He knew that. The exhaustion behind his eyes was a physical weight, a heavy stone resting on the bridge of his nose. He kept them breathing, kept their bellies marginally full, and figured that was the best a ruined man could manage. The bell above Higgins's general store cracked the quiet morning air when Caleb shoved the door open. Heat rushed them, thick, stifling heat, smelling of kerosene, peppermint sticks, and old dust. Caleb stepped inside, his broad frame blocking the light. The murmurs at the back of the store died instantly. Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, stood near the bolts of calico cloth. She took one look at Caleb's matted beard and the dried blood crusting the knees of his trousers, and her mouth thinned into a pale, bloodless line. Beside her, old man Higgins stopped wiping the counter. Caleb ignored them. He walked toward the mercantile counter, his boots leaving clumps of gray mud on the oiled floorboards. Sam and Bess scurried in behind him, immediately darting toward the barrel of dried apples, their dirty fingers grasping at the rim. "Don't touch that," Caleb rasped. His voice sounded like 2 rocks grinding together. It was the first time he'd spoken aloud since Tuesday. The twins ignored him. They always did. It was then Caleb noticed the woman standing at the far end of the counter. She wasn't looking at him. She was counting out copper coins into a leather pouch. Cora Harding. The town called her the Widow Harding to her face, and too wide to wed the second she turned her back. She took up space. Real, undeniable space. Cora was broad-shouldered and thick-waisted, her hips wide beneath a faded gray homespun dress that strained at the seams. She didn't have the fragile, pinched look the other women in Oakhaven cultivated. She looked like a woman built to survive a hard winter. Her hands were large, knuckles red and raw from lye soap, currently tying a knot on a 50-pound sack of flour she had just hoisted onto the counter herself. She smelled like yeast, warm, rising dough and cinnamon, cutting straight through the kerosene reek of the store. Caleb watched her for a fraction of a second. There was no sudden spark of romance, no poetic stirring in his chest. Just a bone-deep, exhausted recognition of a creature as solitary and stubbornly rooted as an oak stump. He turned his attention to Higgins. "Flour, salt, coffee," Caleb said, dropping the stiff pelts onto the counter. The wood groaned under the weight. "And whatever these fetch in rifle cartridges." Higgins poked at the pelts with a pencil, his nose wrinkled. "I ain't giving you top dollar for these, Miller. Skinning's rough. It's meat and fur. Just give me the ledger." A crash echoed from the front of the store. Caleb turned. The tin display of penny candies was on the floor. Peppermints and horehound drops scattered across the dusty wood like glass beads. Bess was on her hands and knees, scrambling to shove a red-striped candy into her mouth. Sam was already chewing, his cheeks bulging, dirt smeared across his forehead. "Filthy little heathens," Mrs. Gable muttered, loud enough to ensure it carried. "Living up there like wild dogs. It's a disgrace to God." Caleb's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck pulled taut. He took a heavy step toward his children, a surge of hot, ugly embarrassment flushing his neck. He didn't feel protective. He felt exposed, incompetent, ashamed. "Put it back!" Caleb barked, grabbing Sam by the collar of his oversized coat and hoisting him off the floor. The boy dangled, kicking his worn boots, hacking a cough that rattled deep in his small chest. "I'm hungry," Sam wailed, a high, piercing sound that made Caleb's head pound. I said drop it. Caleb's grip was too tight. He knew it. He couldn't seem to loosen his fingers. His heart was hammering a frantic, angry rhythm against his ribs. Before he could pry the candy from the boy's dirty fist, a shadow fell over them. Cora. She had moved away from the counter. Up close, Caleb realized she was nearly as tall as he was. Her eyes were a flat, unforgiving hazel. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked down at Bess, who was still on the floor, clutching a peppermint, her lower lip trembling as she stared up at the massive woman in the gray dress. Caleb tightened his grip on Sam's collar, bracing himself. He knew the script. The widow would scold them. She would pull her skirts away from the mud on Bess's knees, maybe offer a tight, pitying smile before joining Mrs. Gable in whispering about the mountain man's feral brood. He squared his shoulders, ready to snap at her, ready to drag his kids out into the freezing mud and leave the flour behind. Cora didn't pull her skirts away. She crouched down. The heavy fabric of her dress settled onto the dusty floorboards, soaking up the grime without a second thought. "That's floor dirt on that candy, girl," Cora said. Her voice wasn't sweet. It was low, resonant, and entirely practical, like the sound of a heavy wooden door closing. Bess blinked, freezing in place. Cora reached out with one red, calloused hand. She didn't snatch the candy. She held her palm flat. "Spit it out, or you'll be passing water out your backside for a week." Bess stared. Then, slowly, the 6-year-old opened her mouth and dropped the half-sucked, dirt-speckled peppermint into Cora's bare palm. Cora wiped her hand on her apron, uncaring of the sticky red stain it left behind. From the deep pocket of her dress, she pulled out a massive, slightly squashed buttermilk biscuit. It looked a day old, hard around the edges. She broke it cleanly in two. She handed one half to Bess. Then she stood, turning her hazel eyes on the boy still dangling from Caleb's fist. She held out the other half. Sam stopped kicking. His eyes blew wide. He reached out and snatched the biscuit, shoving it into his mouth so fast crumbs cascaded down his chin. Caleb finally found his voice. It came out harsher, meaner than he intended. "They don't need your charity. I feed my own." Cora finally looked at him, really looked at him. Her gaze tracked over his grease-stained coat, the dark circles bruising the skin under his eyes, and the white-knuckled grip he still had on his son's coat. "They need a hot bath and a proper meal, Mr. Miller," Cora said, her tone utterly devoid of pity. It was a statement of fact, as dry as the flour she bought. Pride don't fill a stomach, and it don't keep out the frost. The words felt like a slap. Caleb's face burned. He dropped Sam back onto his feet. The boy swayed, chewing loudly. Caleb wanted to yell at her. He wanted to tell her about the nights he stayed awake, terrified the fire would go out, about the blood on the traps, about the silence of the cabin that threatened to deafen him. Instead, he curled his hands into fists at his sides. "Mind your own damn business." Mrs. Gable gasped from the back of the store. "The language!" Cora didn't flinch. She just stared at him, a flicker of something annoyance, maybe fatigue crossing her wide face. "My business is my own, just like those children are yours. Though it looks like neither of us is doing a stellar job of managing our affairs today." She gestured vaguely to the knocked-over candy display. "I'll pay for the peppermints, Higgins." "You don't pay for my kids' messes," Caleb growled, stepping into her space. He was trying to intimidate her, a reflex born of dealing with wolves and drunken trappers. Cora stood her ground. Her broad chest rose and fell evenly. She smelled of cinnamon and quiet defiance. "Then put $1 on the counter and stop barking at me, Mr. Miller. I ain't one of your hounds." Caleb froze. The sheer, immovable mass of her halted his anger in its tracks. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't disgusted by him. She was just dealing with him. Like a broken wagon wheel in the middle of the road. Sam suddenly stepped forward. He bypassed Caleb entirely and grabbed handfuls of Cora's thick gray skirt. "We want her, Daddy," Sam said, his voice ringing out in the suddenly dead-silent store. Bess, having finished her half of the biscuit, scrambled up and grabbed the other side of Cora's skirt, burying her filthy face into the fabric. "Want her." The silence in Higgins' general store became suffocating. The crackle of the iron stove sounded like cannon fire. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold and prickling. Mrs. Gable let out a bark of startled, cruel laughter. "Well, I suppose beggars can't be choosers. The widower and the widow. Ain't that a matching set of cast-offs?" Caleb's vision tunneled. The humiliation was absolute. His own children, starving for a mother's warmth, clinging to a woman the town ridiculed, begging for her right in front of the people who despised him. It laid bare every failure, every inadequacy he possessed. He didn't act like a hero. He acted like a cornered animal. He leaned down, grabbing both children by the scruffs of their coats, ripping them away from Cora's skirts. Bess started to cry, a high, reedy wail. "Shut up," Caleb hissed, his voice shaking. He looked at Cora, his eyes blazing with a mixture of raw mortification and helpless fury. "Keep your biscuits to yourself." Cora looked down at the muddy handprints the twins had left on her dress. Then she looked back up at Caleb. Her face was perfectly smooth, masking whatever sting his words or Mrs. Gable's laughter had caused. "Higgins," Cora called out, not breaking eye contact with Caleb, "put Mr. Miller's salt and coffee on my ledger. He seems to be in a rush." "I don't want your money," Caleb shouted, backing away toward the door, dragging the sobbing twins with him. "It ain't about what you want," Cora said softly, the words barely carrying over Bess's crying. "It's about what they need." Caleb shoved backward out the door, the bell violently clanging overhead. The cold air hit him like a physical blow. He stood on the boardwalk, chest heaving, the twins crying at his knees, staring through the glass window. Inside, Cora Harding stood completely still. She didn't look triumphant. She didn't look broken. She just looked incredibly, devastatingly lonely. And as Caleb turned to drag his children back up the mountain, a treacherous, unwanted thought pierced through his anger. He wanted her, too. The storm hit 3 days later. It didn't roll in with a dramatic clap of thunder. It crept up the ridge like a thief, stealing the light by noon and replacing it with a suffocating, blinding white. Inside the cabin, the draft whistled through the mud chinking. Caleb fed the hearth with green pine. It smoked and hissed, filling the single room with a bitter, eye-watering haze that clung to the low rafters. He sat on the edge of his cot, dragging a whetstone across his hunting knife. The metallic times was the only sound keeping him tethered to his sanity. That and the terrifying, wet rattle in Sam's chest. The boy lay on a pile of wolf skins, tangled with his sister. Bess was quiet, her thumb wedged in her mouth, her eyes wide and glassy in the dim firelight. But Sam was burning. His skin was flush and tight, radiating a dry, prickly heat that Caleb could feel from a foot away. Every breath the boy took sounded like tearing canvas. "Drink," Caleb coaxed, lifting a tin cup of tepid water to Sam's cracked lips. Sam turned his head away, letting out a weak, mewling whimper. He didn't have the energy to fight. That scared Caleb more than the tantrums. Caleb set the cup down. His hands were shaking. He looked at his own palms, calloused, scarred, stained with tannin and dirt. Hands built for killing, for skinning, for surviving. Utterly useless for healing. He had brewed willow bark. He had piled on the furs. He had kept the fire blazing until his woodpile was entirely depleted, leaving only the damp green logs he'd chopped yesterday. It wasn't enough. The cold was winning. The sickness was winning. He looked at the small, filthy faces of his children. "We want her, Daddy." The memory of the mercantile made his stomach pitch. The humiliation had festered in him for days, a hot, angry coal he couldn't spit out. He had told himself he didn't need anyone. He had survived the war, the harsh winters, the death of his wife. He was Caleb Miller. He didn't need the pity of a town that looked at him like he was a stray, rabid dog. But as Sam coughed a violent, full-body spasm that left the boy gasping for air, his lips tinged a terrifying shade of blue, Caleb realized the truth. His pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. It was a noose he was wrapping around his own children's necks. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the plank floor. "Bess," he said, his voice cracking, "get your boots on." It took him 20 minutes to bundle them. He wrapped Sam in a heavy wool blanket, tying it around the boy's waist with a length of rope to keep the cold out. He strapped Bess into his old canvas pack, hoisting her onto his back. She felt as light as a bundle of dry kindling. He picked Sam up in his arms. The boy was dead weight, his breath hitching irregularly. Caleb kicked the cabin door open. The wind hit him with the force of a swinging anvil. The snow was thigh-deep, a swirling, disorienting void that erased the tree line and the trail. The temperature was dropping so fast, Caleb felt the moisture in his nostrils freeze instantly. He didn't head for the town. The town was 2 miles away, and he knew Mrs. Gable or Higgins would waste precious time lecturing him, judging him, before lifting a finger to help. He aimed for the valley edge, 1.5 miles down the ridge, the Harding farm. Every step was a battle. The snow dragged at his boots, threatening to snap his ankles. The muscles in his thighs burned, then cramped, then went mercifully numb. The wind screamed through the pines, driving ice crystals into his eyes until his vision blurred red. He couldn't feel his fingers. He could only feel the faint, erratic thump of Sam's heart against his chest. "Don't stop," he told himself. The thought was sluggish, frozen. You stop, they die. He fell twice. The second time, he went down hard on his knees, snow packing into his collar. Bess let out a muffled cry from the pack. Caleb stayed there for a long moment, the white noise of the blizzard roaring in his ears. The urge to just lie down, to let the snow cover them and end the bone-crushing exhaustion, was a physical weight pressing on his spine. Then he smelled it, faint, snatched away by the wind, but there. Wood smoke. Not the bitter, pitchy smoke of his green pine, but the sweet, clean scent of Sealand oak. He forced himself upright, his joints popping. Through the driving snow, a square of yellow light bled into the whiteout. He didn't remember crossing the yard. He didn't remember climbing the porch steps. He only remembered the heavy oak door, and the raw, desperate sound of his own fist pounding against it. The door opened. Cora stood there. She wore a thick wool shawl over her nightgown, her gray-streaked hair braided down her back. She held a kerosene lantern. The light spilled over Caleb, illuminating the ice frozen in his beard, the frantic, terrified wideness of his eyes, and the limp bundle in his arms. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to apologize for his pride. Help was the only sound that scraped out of his throat before his knees buckled. Cora didn't gasp. She didn't ask questions. She simply reached out with her large, capable hands and hauled him forward by the lapel of his coat, dragging him and the children out of the storm and into the warmth. The farmhouse kitchen was a wall of heat. It smelled of dried lavender, baking soda, and the sharp, medicinal tang of eucalyptus. Cora kicked the front door shut, throwing the iron bolt. She didn't look at Caleb, who was collapsed on the braided rug, shivering so violently his teeth clicked. She immediately took Sam from his arms. "Get the girl out of that pack," Cora ordered. Her voice was the same low, immovable timbre it had been in the store. It broke through Caleb's panic like an axe through ice. He fumbled with the straps, his frozen fingers useless. Cora set Sam on the heavy oak table, sweeping a basket of mending onto the floor without a second glance. She turned back, swatted Caleb's clumsy hands away, and unbuckled the pack herself. She lifted Bess out, peeling the frozen, stiff coat off the little girl. "Sit by the stove," Cora told him, pushing him roughly toward the cast-iron behemoth radiating heat in the corner. "Don't touch the metal. You'll leave your skin on it." Caleb obeyed. He slumped into a wooden chair, his chest heaving, watching her. Cora moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. She wasn't delicate. She didn't flutter. She filled a tin basin from the reservoir on the back of the stove, testing the heat with her elbow. She stripped Sam of his filthy, sweat-soaked clothes, tossing them directly into the firebox. When she wiped a warm, wet cloth over the boy's dirt-caked chest, Sam thrashed, letting out a terrible, rasping cough. "I know, boy, I know," Cora murmured. It wasn't a coo. It was a rough, grounding vibration in her chest. She opened a jar on the counter, scooping out a pungent yellow paste, mustard and lard. She slathered it thick on a piece of flannel and slapped it onto Sam's chest, ignoring his weak cry of protest. She bound it tight with strips of clean linen, then forced a spoonful of dark, foul-smelling syrup past his lips. Next, she turned to Bess. The girl wasn't feverish, just terrifyingly cold and frightened. Cora washed her hands, face, and feet, then wrapped her in a quilt that smelled of sunshine and cedar. She placed Bess in a rocking chair near the stove, pressing a warm mug of broth into her small hands. It took an hour of Cora working in the quiet kitchen, the storm raging outside, while Caleb thawed, the sharp agony of returning circulation burning in his hands and feet. Eventually, the rattling in Sam's chest eased. The mustard poultice worked its brutal magic, drawing the heat out of his lungs. His breathing smoothed into a shallow, exhausted rhythm. He fell asleep on the table, cocooned in blankets. Bess was already asleep in the rocker, the empty mug resting in her lap. Cora finally stopped moving. She stood by the table, resting her hands on her hips, her broad shoulders slumping just a fraction. She looked at the muddy puddles melting onto her clean floorboards, then up at Caleb. He looked back. He felt entirely stripped bare. There was no defiance left in him. The mountain man, the stoic loner, the defensive father, all of it had frozen and cracked off in the blizzard, leaving only a terrified, failing man. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," Caleb said. The words tasted like ash. Cora walked over to the stove. She poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug and set it on the table in front of him. "Drink it black. It'll stop the shivering." He wrapped his raw hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into his palms. "I would have paid Higgins, or the doctor. I couldn't make it to town." "The doctor's in the next county delivering the Miller baby," Cora said flatly, sitting in the chair opposite him. She didn't bother pulling her shawl tighter. She sat solid and square. "And Higgins would have let you freeze on his porch before dirtying his parlor. You made the right turn." Silence stretched between them, heavy and complicated. The wind battered the side of the house, rattling the window panes, but inside, the massive oak beams held firm. "They like you," Caleb said quietly, staring into his black coffee. "They're hungry. I had biscuits. Don't mistake a survival instinct for affection, Mr. Miller." "Caleb." He looked up at her. "My name is Caleb." Cora studied him. Her hazel eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She saw the exhaustion, the dirt, the shame. But she didn't look away. For a woman who had been stared at and whispered about her whole life, she held his gaze without an ounce of self-consciousness. "You're making a mess of those kids, Caleb," she said. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation, delivered with the same practical tone she used to measure flour. Caleb flinched, but he didn't argue. "I know. I try to. I set the traps. I bring in the meat. But the cabin, the quiet, it's too loud. Since their mother died, I can't seem to get ahead of the rot." "You're trying to haul a heavy wagon with one horse," Cora said, leaning back in her chair. "It ain't about trying harder. It's about physics. The mud is deep. The load is heavy. You need another shoulder on the yoke." Caleb watched her hands resting on the table. They were big hands, strong hands. Not the pale, fluttering hands of the women in town who whispered behind their fans. They were hands that could chop wood, fire a rifle, and force medicine down a dying child's throat. "The town," Caleb started, his voice thick. "They say things about you. They say, I'm ugly. They say, I'm too big, too loud, too stubborn to catch a husband after mine passed." Cora offered a grim, humorless smile. "They say, I take up too much space. They ain't wrong." "They're fools," Caleb said, the words slipping out before he could stop them, and he meant it. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, the anchor in the storm, the steady warmth that had just saved his son's life, and thought the men in Oakhaven were the blindest idiots God ever put breath into. Cora's expression shifted, softening just a fraction around the edges. She looked away, staring at the cast-iron stove. "I don't need a man to survive, Caleb. I've got this farm. I pull my own weight." "I know," he said softly. He set his mug down. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I don't need you to survive either. I can trap. I can shoot. I can stay up on that ridge until the cold takes me." He swallowed hard, the vulnerability feeling like a physical ache in his throat. "But the kids, they knew it before I did, down in the store, when they grabbed your dress." Cora looked back at him, her chest rising and falling slowly. "Knew what?" "That we're freezing to death up there," Caleb whispered, "and you're the only warm thing we've found." He didn't cross the room. He didn't drop to his knees or offer poetic promises he couldn't keep. He just sat there, a broken, dirty man, offering her the exact shape of his ruin. Cora stared at him for a long time. The wind howled outside, throwing a spray of ice against the glass. Finally, she stood up. She walked over to the stove, picked up a heavy iron poker, and shifted the burning logs inside. Sparks flew up the chimney in a bright, violent rush. "There's a cot in the back room," Cora said, not looking at him, her voice entirely practical. "You can sleep there tonight. Tomorrow, when the storm breaks, we'll take a sled up to that ridge and fetch your things." Caleb felt a massive, invisible weight slide off his chest. The relief was so absolute it made him dizzy. He watched her back, the solid, unyielding line of her shoulders. "You sure?" Caleb asked, his voice rough. Cora turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. For the first time, a genuine, subtle smile touched the corners of her mouth, crinkling the skin around her eyes. "I've got a big house, Caleb," she said quietly. "I reckon there's finally enough space for you to take up some of it." Sometimes the deepest love isn't found in a crowded ballroom, but in the quiet warmth of a farmhouse kitchen after a bitter storm. If you felt the chill of the mountain and the heat of Cora's hearth, hit that like button and share this story with someone who appreciates a rugged, real romance. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more grounded, gritty Western dramas every single week. What did you think of Caleb's choice? Comment below.